Good evening. Welcome. My name is Andrew Torrance, and I'm one of the organisers of these lectures alongside Professor Eric Priest and Professor Judith Wolf. I should also add this lecture is sponsored by a generous grant from the Blankmeyer Foundation. Before I introduce our speaker, can I just mention that you will see some surveys that are out and about. If you were able to fill these out, that would be greatly appreciated, and then if you could drop them down here at the front at the end of the lecture, that would be fantastic. The other thing I'll mention is that the next James Gregory lecture will be taking place on March 4th, and the speaker will be the psychologist Justin Barrett, who should be excellent. Now to this evening's speaker. Professor Philip Clayton is the Ingraham Professor of Theology at Claremont School of Theology. He is widely regarded as one of the world's leading experts in the field of science and religion, and he is also prolific in the areas of comparative theology, philosophy of religion, and eco-theology. He has many, many books, and I would encourage you to check out some of these on his website. But for some of his more recent books, these will include What is Ecological Civilization and The New Possible, Visions of Our World Beyond Crisis, which both focus on the current environmental crisis. But Professor Clayton is not merely an academic. He is admirably committed to employing his research to his activism, particularly in his capacity as the president for the Institute for Ecological Civilization. In this role, he works to convene, facilitate, and catalyze multi-sectoral initiatives towards ecological civilization. Professor Clayton is also a board member of the John Templeton Foundation, which has been another generous funder of many of these lectures. So it is an enormous privilege and a tremendous honour to welcome Professor Clayton here this evening to address the question, can we update religion for the Anthropocene?
Appreciate it. Well, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Eric, for your generous hospitality, for all of you for coming out this afternoon to be a part of this session, and for the university for the invitation. I want to say on a personal level that I spent much of my life doing the most abstract things you can possibly do in the field of science and religion, right? So some people might think about ethical issues. I would do the ontology of science or the metaphysics, ultimate significance of various terms. In the scientific side, I worked mostly on theoretical biology, which is the limits of biology touching up toward philosophy, or philosophy of quantum mechanics. And as the ecological crisis got worse, I thought I need to leave that field and go to places where we can really have impact. So tonight's lecture is one of the times when I get to come back to my home field and to find out what it might have to offer to a world in crisis. To be honest then, this is an exploration for me to see whether we can make the link between the science of religion or theology and science discussions and the most important issues of our day. And to be honest, as you do the evaluations, I would be most honored if you would hold me accountable to that question and ask, is there something gained by the inquiries that underlie this talk? Right? Can we update religion for the Anthropocene? I have to say, again, thank you for the invitation to the James Gregory Lecture. Many friends and scholars whom I deeply admire have stood at this podium, or an equivalent, functional equivalent of it, and I'm honored to join their list. I was tempted to start in a more roundabout way by exploring what it might mean to update a religion in more general terms, pushed on by some questions from Andrew. By considering the various ways that religions, or religion as such, might be updated, in quotes, and then by arguing it's not sacrilegious to attempt such a thing. But given the urgency of tonight's topic, I would like to go straight to the heart of the matter. That is, the concerns about religion that give rise in the first place to this language of updating then where better to start an inquiry about where religion may be updating than with the country whose versions of many religions seem most urgently to be in need of updating, the United States. So we'll start there. Religion in the US today is, to put it bluntly, not a pretty picture. Several surveys released earlier this month found that people who strongly identify with their religious beliefs in the United States tend to dismiss the overwhelming scientific consensus that the planet is warming at an unprecedented rate and humans are behind it. So, it was just a few weeks ago, on August 3rd, that the Pew Research Center published a new study on what religious people in the US believe about climate change. Here we go. Only 44% of American Catholics believe in anthropogenic climate change. That is, climate change caused by humans. 29% believe that global warming just reflects natural patterns. And a painful 13% of American Catholics don't even believe that average global temperatures are in fact rising. The next day, October 4th, it was a bad month for American religious life. The Public Religion Research Institute published a separate set of results on a similar topic. Okay, they're looking at Americans who either identify with religion as the most important thing in their lives, among many important things, down to not so important. Okay, so that's the scale. And then how that correlates with a number of different beliefs about climate change and climate science. Among Americans who say that religion is the most important thing in their lives, only 39% agree that humans are causing global warming. Barely over a third. Among those who say religion is one of many important things, the number jumps to 56. Almost 2/3, 65% of Americans who said that religion is not as important as other things do believe that humans cause climate change, and nearly 4/5, 78% of people for whom religion is not as important as other things agree that climate change is human caused. That's a bad correlation for religion, speaking as somebody who works on climate change. And then you want to know which group is the most anti-scientific of all the American subgroups within religion? You guessed it, white evangelical Protestants. You're not surprised. Only 31% of white evangelical Protestants believe in human-caused climate change in the US. So, the conclusions from this new survey data are clear. There seems to be an inverse correlation between popular forms of religious belief and, on the other hand, belief in climate science. So, in the US survey data, the more highly people value their religious beliefs, the less likely they are to believe that human activity is causing global warming, despite overwhelming empirical evidence that supports this conclusion. Over 99% of climate scientists, it's actually the last thing I read, was 99.7% think that it's established, anthropogenic climate change is established. Okay, then I wrote worse, colon. I mean, that sounded bad, but worse, right-wing media in the US, and you might have something to do with this, I'm told. Right-wing media in the US are actively and intentionally broadcasting climate disinformation to these very same conservative religious groups. Quote, right-wing media like Fox News and Breitbart actively stoke the flames of the American culture wars and make money in the process, framing efforts to address climate change and other hot-button topics as an attack on personal, cultural, and religious freedoms. The science is ipso facto an attack on your religious freedom, or so goes the argument. So when Pope Francis published his papal letter on climate change, Laudato Si', in 2015, Fox News called him, quote, the most dangerous person on the planet. Let's look at it. And suggested that he had aligned with, quote, extremists who favor widespread population control and wealth redistribution. Conservative media persistently erode trust in science and scientists by likening climate change, this is a conscious strategy, likening climate change to a religion ad nauseum. So argues Media Matters America, a progressive media watchdog group in 2015. Quote, by doing so, these conservative media implicitly frame climate change skeptics as, quote, brave dissidents against an oppressive set of belief. Climate change deniers are brave dissidents. That's later when they began to call Pope Francis the woke Pope. And listen to this quote from public media. Quote, there is no statistical evidence that global warming is intensifying hurricanes, floods, droughts, and such like natural disasters, or making them more frequent. That is in direct contradiction to the empirical, well-established empirical evidence. This is Thomas Williams writing for Breitbart, citing the false and misleading talking points of a known climate disinformation campaign. Quote, he adds, however, there's ample evidence that CO2 mitigation measures are as damaging as they are costly. Also false. Okay, of course, it's not just white American evangelicals who reject climate science, and this is actually the serious part. We can find similar percentages among Muslims in Turkey, Hindus in India, and other religions in other countries, and I could cite that data. Presumably, you already know the data on religious persons in the UK who dismiss the scientific consensus on climate change, and perhaps you can add that into the discussion afterwards. That's my first intermediate conclusion. Conservative religious belief, especially when politically motivated, often decreases people's ability to understand the strength of the scientific evidence and then to take appropriate action. And that is, if I might editorialize, a damning conclusion. So why does religious opposition to climate science matter? For most in this room, I presume this doesn't need to be said, but I want it on record. Because the sciences are the most reliable way to predict future states of the natural world. Predicting the future helps us to better prepare adequately for it. It seems almost tautological. I assume that scientific research is a better predictor than, say, a Ouija board, or strong inner intuitions, or a horoscope, or a survey of your friends, depending on who your friends are. The heart of science is to collect precise data, form hypotheses to explain that data, and then test them, ideally by predicting an outcome and then measuring or testing to see whether your prediction is true. The climate sciences, then, are the best means we have for predicting the future of the Earth's climate, period. They also help us predict the social and economic effects of a rapidly changing climate. And having reliable predictions of climate change is the best way to prepare for it, or at least for taking steps that will mitigate the changes. That's why it matters. If that paragraph is true, and I deeply believe that the history of science and present science practice shows it's true, then there's something so dangerous in the data that we're looking at. And that's what sets up this talk. That's where the updating comes from. Okay, so here's where we stand at the end of part one. Significant groups within multiple religions, usually but not always conservative believers, actively deny predictions about global warming that are affirmed by over 99% of climate scientists. But understanding and predicting global warming and the impact is crucial if humanity is to adapt to a changing world. So, if it's possible to update the parts of religion that are causing the problem, we have every reason to do so. Part 2, the Anthropocene. My title suggested, as you saw, updating religion for the Anthropocene. The suffix "scene" is used, this is a quick review, but I think it's important as we head into recent discoveries with Lynn Crawford. Scene is used that designate various eras of Earth's history, and the name Anthropocene was coined in 2000. Actually didn't remember that it was so recent, to name, quote, the recent age of man, roughly, in etymology. Many geologists are now saying that humans have become the major geological force on this planet. What are their reasons? A quick review. Geology is the study of the Earth and its history. Our planet's history is broken down in 4 massive eons, and they, in turn, in 10 distinct eras. So reading left to right, and then most recent at the top. Each era includes distinctive periods. Within each period, geologists find evidence of specific epochs. So as you can see, we're in the Phanerozoic eon, Cenozoic era, and Quaternary period, the big yellow box. Our particular epoch is, or was, called the Holocene. The Holocene began 11,700 years ago, which is when the last glacial period ended and the Stone Age began. So the first of the periods of what we think of as modern civilization. So the entire epoch, from the dawn of civilization to the present, occurred after the receipt of the massive glacier, which left behind fertile soil and temperatures warm enough for agriculture to develop. The correlation cannot be emphasized enough. Civilization has depended on agriculture, and agriculture has depended on particular climate conditions, roughly, with some changes. For decades, scholars have been saying that we've entered a new period when the human species has become the primary influence on the planet. Humans have torn down a huge, this is now just anecdotal. Why would you think that we might be in a new period? Well, humans have torn down a large percentage of the global forests, have reduced complex biosystems to billions of acres of cropland, have built dams and diverted waterways, have covered the face of the planet with cities. We also have evidence that roughly since 1840, that's the end of the first industrial revolution here in the UK, human activities have begun to increase planetary temperatures in measurable ways. Though, in the first industrial revolution, it's pretty slight increase if you look at the numbers. That fact by itself would not make humans the most significant geological force on the planet. That dubious honor for humanity, geologists tell us, came in the years after 1950. Now again, anecdotally, so before we had the solid geological evidence, it seemed that it was important to note those are the years when humans began test explosions of nuclear warheads. More than 2,000 hydrogen bombs were exploded by 8 countries, including the UK, about half of them by the US. For example, a singular nuclear warhead detonated by the United States on an atoll in the Pacific Marshall Islands in 1952 produced a blast 700 times more powerful than the bomb that the United States dropped on Hiroshima in 1945. Today, after thousands of these explosions, radioactive trace elements have been distributed across the entire globe, from the highest mountains to the deepest ocean floors. Now, ecologists have used that fact for decades to argue we're heading into a new age. But geologists rightly resist it. It's not yet enough. How do we prove scientifically that humanity has become the most important geological force on the planet? It's only been in the last year that precise empirical evidence of humanity's global effects has been discovered. And this is great science. These are the things that make you love science. The hero of the story is Crawford Lake, a small lake about an hour west of Toronto in eastern Canada. Because of the highly unusual features of Crawford Lake, samples of the chemical composition of the atmosphere settle to the bottom and are sealed into distinct layers for each summer and winter. There's a story of why this happens, a complicated story that in the references to this paper you can see the data. So each layer of the lake can be precisely dated. So this is a picture of the core samples. You know, core is when you take, it's deeply frozen in this case, hollow pipe, you put it down, and then you raise a core that gives you a vertical record. Here they're taking part of the core and chucking it up. So they've been removed. They provide a precise history book of the chemical composition of the atmosphere of our planet that goes back hundreds of years. Evidence of the beginning and magnitude of human effects to the highest scientific standards. By the way, you know that geologists have to vote 3 different groups, and if a site is found, and there must always be a site that passes, it gets a golden spike. And it actually goes and gets placed by the lake. We're through the first stage. People are saying it looks like it's going to go through. I mean, we listen in the back hallways to see who's going to vote for it and so forth, but it looks like this is going to happen. Crawford Lake reveals close to 1,000 years of human impact, year by year, season by season. So a native group lived next to the lake for 100 years. And we even in 1500 to 1600, no, 1400, 1500, and we even can see little effects of their presence all these years later. I mean, it's an amazing scientific discovery. What the scientists discovered, however, is that the effects from the last 70 years are so radically out of line with anything in the past 1,000 years that, and this is, I'm citing Canadian Geographic here, describes the new period as the Great Acceleration. That's the period after the Second World War when human activity began to overwhelm Earth's operating systems. Population surged, so did industry driven by burning fossil fuels, which loaded the atmosphere with carbon dioxide. Add to that, and this is again from the core, plastics, nuclear tests, nitrogen-based fertilizers, and species depletions. I really encourage you to look at it. Detailed science, beautiful, flawless science. Commenting on the data, Professor Waters, a geologist at the University of Leicester, writes, quote, when you combine these data points and read the stories that they tell you, they show you that there is this very significant and very rapid change to the environment in a very short period of time. Again, quoting Canadian geologist at Canadian Geographic, by 1950 or so, a rapid, dramatic increase of carbon-based particles shows up from industrial processes, including coal-fired steelmaking in the nearby Hamilton foundry, as well as a rapid rise in plutonium from nuclear testing, a change in nitrogen isotopes from fertilizer use, and the chemical fallout from acid rain. Wow. It's like, you know, you caught the guy barehanded, the guy being us, and the years being the last 70 years. You can look at the products, you know how they break down, you look at the layers, each one carefully distinguished from the next, as if the cosmic scientist was saying, hey guys, work on this one. In short, about 70 years ago, the roughly 12,000 years of the Holocene epoch ended. To be living now in the Anthropocene is to be living in an age where the hand of man is rapidly transforming the planet as a whole. So what does it call for? Thinking about the implications of science. For some of us as persons of faith, for others of us as people who care about the planet, or as environmentalists, or just as a sort of human ethic or concern for our grandchildren. What does it call for? We learned at the beginning of this month that September was an astonishing 0.5 degrees Celsius hotter than the prior record. That is almost a full degree Fahrenheit hotter. We watch climate scientists struggling to find words for what this means. Quote, staggering, unnerving, mind-boggling, and as the Guardian quoted, absolutely gobsmackingly bananas. And I'm sure you've seen, you see these graphs of the different months. And then here's this one point, and that's our September global temperature. I mean, it's a kind of. Our choices are having massive effects on ecosystems around the world. GHG, so greenhouse gases, are at their highest levels in 4 million years. Average temperatures are higher than they've been since before the Stone Age. Ecosystems are rapidly being destroyed by the climate change and human encroachment. Species are going extinct at a faster rate than in hundreds of thousands of years. This is, ladies and gentlemen, the first time in the history of humanity that the human race has faced a truly global challenge of this kind. Not of this magnitude, of this kind. We could talk about that. To respond appropriately, two things are required. First, we have to grasp what it means, as the old children's song puts it, to have the whole world in our hands. That is, we have to understand exactly what the scientists are telling us about our situation and its implications. And second, we have to learn to think globally in order to act appropriately. Dreiser and Pickering put it beautifully in a recent paper. This task requires a capacity to, this is well said, to rethink what nature means. Embodying that capacity in institutions. Thirdly, using that capacity to shape environmental policies that, fourthly, cultivate conditions for flourishing into the future rather than returning to the past. It's probably the best single sentence I can find of what it means to be an Anthropocene. The climate scientist Zeke Hausfather emphasizes that, quote, progress is possible and despair is counterproductive. The world is on the brink of a clean energy transition. The International Energy Agency recently estimated that a whopping $1.8 trillion will be invested in clean energy technologies like renewables, electric cars, and heat pumps in 2023, up from roughly $300 billion a decade ago. Prices of solar, wind, and batteries have plummeted over the last 15 years, and for much of the world, solar power is now the cheapest form of electricity. Lots of data on that we can talk about in the discussion. If we reduce emissions quickly, we can switch from a world in which warming is accelerating to one in which it's slowing. Eventually, we can stop it entirely. Can I just put in a plug for a recent novel called Ministry for the Future by John Stanley Robinson, Kim Stanley Robinson. He puts together the data of how this could be possible into a novel imagining an office at the United Nations, Ministry for the Future, and shows how success would be possible. A lot of people I work with in climate change feel incredible discouragement, and I just bought a stack of these books and I'm sending them out to scientists. We held a meeting, I chaired a meeting at the Harvard Center for the Environment last year, and the chair began with just such a downward note, and several of the scientists said, I can't write a chapter for a book called What Must Be Done? Climate Change. Climate Change, What Must Be Done? Because I don't know what we can do. So that last sentence is our biggest struggle. I mean, the struggle with hopelessness for the scientists is sometimes the biggest struggle. So I wanted to include this. And then just to add how he finishes, Zeke says, we're far from on track to meet our climate goals, and much more work remains, but the positive steps we've made over the past decade should reinforce to us that progress is possible and despair is counterproductive. Despite the recent acceleration of warming, humans remain firmly in the driver's seat, and the future of our climate is still up for us to decide. That's true. Just to hold on to that. We remain firmly in the driver's seat. This is not something where we're being carried along. We're not at a good place in exponential curves, but we are still in the driver's seat. That's super important. I remember that Greta Thunberg was interviewed. So what will you do? You're fighting for 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. What will you do if we fail to meet that goal? She said, I'll go to bed, and in the morning I'll get up and I'll start fighting for 1.6. That's the right answer. So this is what this new era, the Anthropocene, calls for. And that immediately raises the question, how can religion be helpful in this task? So now the other part of my mandate. Religion is tied to what's most deeply meaningful to an individual, community, or culture. It's rooted in what is ultimately real and ultimately valuable. Since early in human civilization, religion has been one of the strongest motivators of belief and action. Some of the most altruistic lives ever lived have been motivated by religious beliefs and experiences, as have great artistic and cultural achievements. Yet, it's also true that some of the most atrocious behaviors ever carried out by human beings were also spawned by religious beliefs. The massacre of Israeli citizens a few weeks ago was motivated, at least in part, by the religious beliefs of Hamas fighters. They even named their attack on Saturday, October 7th, just after dawn on Shabbat, the Al-Aqsa Storm, to make clear that it was a response to what Hamas saw as the desecration of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem by Jews. Of course, the atrocities are not one-sided. Israeli missiles are killing civilians in schools, hospitals, and places of worship. Religion's relationship to the environment is equally two-sided. That's an important point. We have already seen how religious people can be unbending opponents to the science of climate change. But what about the other side of the story? Can religious belief deepen environmental commitment? Over the next few minutes, I'd like to explore this pathway with you. In my title, I use the provocative phrase, updating religion, to name this task. So when it comes to this task, you may think that humans rewrite religion on their own, or others of you may believe that religious leaders are actually bringing resources to the surface that were always already there within their tradition. And that actually could be an interesting debate point afterwards. Whichever it is, let's now explore some of the ways that religion is being updated for the Anthropocene. Just a few weeks ago, Pope Francis released a new papal letter, as you know, challenging the, quote, irresponsible lifestyle of the world's wealthy and chastising those who are undercutting efforts to address the climate crisis or even to deny its very existence. Pope Francis wrote, despite all attempts to denial, conceal, gloss over, or relativize the issue, the signs of climate change are here and increasingly evident. No one can ignore the fact that in recent years we have witnessed extreme weather phenomena, frequent periods of unusual heat, drought, and other cries of protest. Our responses have not been adequate, while the world in which we live is collapsing and maybe nearing the breaking point. We need lucidity and honesty in order to recognize in time that our power and the progress we are producing are turning against us. The difference in tone between Laudato Deum 2023 and Laudato Si 2015 is remarkable. That's what commentators are saying. And that's worth thinking about. I give them a lot of credit for that, frankly. Pope Francis is calling not only Catholics. Remember, Laudato Si was written not for Catholics, as encyclicals usually are, but for all humanity. In the preface, it's one of the things that really made that document stand out. Not only Catholics, but spiritually motivated people around the world to become leaders in protecting and restoring ecosystems. If religious leaders speak out strongly for creation care, motivating the billions of people who are members of their religions, this movement of, we call it spiritual ecology, or theologically motivated ecology, could be decisive in bringing about a more ecological civilization. As Bill McKibben, famous founder of 350.org, wrote recently, the work of spiritual leaders around the world may be our best chance of getting hold of things. Yes, the engineers have done their job. Yes, the scientists have done their job. Congratulations to you who are here. But it's high time for the human heart to do its job. That's what we need that leadership for. I think that's beautifully put. I think I probably should skip over some details on the question, is it inappropriate for religions or theologians to really focus on speaking to their particular age. There are conservative theological voices that would say, yeah, that's inappropriate. You're to exegete the texts in which divine revelation occurred. And of course, you can apply it like a pastor applies it in a sermon, but to sort of rethink it is inappropriate. I think there's a strong answer to that, which I spell out in the longer version of the paper. In every religious tradition, core beliefs have been directed toward the context. Whether you think of Confucianism, Gautama Buddha in the founding of Buddhism, Prophet Muhammad. I mean, in each case, there's a context to which the person spoke. And as the years went by, each religion has found ways to speak to its emerging context. So the criticism that it's inappropriate to do this task, I think, is a misunderstanding of how religions have always had their origin and their metamorphosis over time. Happy to come back to that in the debate, but I want to make sure we have enough time for the discussion. So, part 4, and this is the final part, eco-spiritualities and eco-theologies. My thesis in the closing part of this talk is simple. We really can draw on our religious traditions to respond to the defining features of the Anthropocene. That's my thesis. It makes sense, and it's productive to draw on multiple religious traditions to respond to the Anthropocene. There are two sides of this task: updating practices and updating beliefs. Let's use the word eco-spiritualities to cover the attitudes and practices that arise when religion meets ecology. And then we can speak of eco-theologies, or maybe for some, eco-worldviews, eco-philosophies, as the place where religious or worldview or philosophy beliefs and ecological insights meet. Okay, so two different spheres. I spoke to high school students earlier today, and we focus on eco-spiritualities because their interest in theology was, I have to admit, not very high. With you, though, I'd like to take on the beliefs because it's the harder part. So if I can do a kind of quick summary of the eco-spirituality side, I think it's easier to grasp. And then you make me do the hard work, in the honor of James Gregory, to struggle with how I would take beliefs of theistic traditions or of my Christian tradition in particular and do this task. And the same is going on among Buddhists and Hindus. There's a Harvard University series edited by Mary Evelyn Tucker that has 12 volumes, I think, takes most of the religions of the world and talks about how they can be oriented, their beliefs can be oriented toward the ecological crisis. I'd strongly recommend. I mean, brilliant books. The best book on Islam and ecology, the best book on Jainism and ecology are in Mary Evelyn Tucker's series. So there's a lot of scholarship in this area. So two sides, eco-spirituality, and then so eco-theologies, or for the non-religious, eco-worldviews, or for philosophers, eco-philosophies. So first, the eco-spiritualities. So I have the privilege of speaking on this topic in multiple cultures and places around the world. I'll tell the stories later. I have the sense that most people already understand the idea of a spirituality of the earth, whether or not they use the term eco-spirituality. When people both care about ecology and engage consciously in spiritual practices, they, and the groups they participate in, are already evolving eco-spiritual practices. I want to show a few quotes to give you a sense of it, and maybe tell a personal story on this side before going into the hard work that you expected me today. So Mark Wallace, I think, has a beautiful description of it. The global environmental crisis, quote, is a matter of the heart, not the head. That's the sign that you're in the eco-spirituality side, right? And this is crucial. I mean, I'm pausing here because I believe without this, beliefs alone won't be enough. That attitude toward the earth is crucial for us getting through this. We no longer experience our co-belonging with nature in such a way that we're willing to alter our lifestyles in order to build a more sustainable future. Implied is, but if we experience our co-belonging with nature in a different way, we will be willing to do those things. I wanted to include a quote from a scientist who takes the scientific side and this sort of more affective side and brings them together. And this is from Ursula Goodenough, The Sacred Depths of Nature, Oxford University Press. One of my favorite quotes. As a cell biologist, I experience the same kind of awe and reverence when I contemplate the structure of an enzyme or the flowing of a signal transduction cascade as when I watch the moon rise or stand in front of a Mayan temple. Beautiful phrase, same rush, same rapture. And that's the experiential part of doing science and the experiential part of being connected with nature, and the parallel, nobody said the parallel more sharply than Ursula has. And the Muslim Sufi poet Hafiz, he gets a word here, because it's a kind of eco spirituality. Leave the familiar for a while. Let your senses and bodies stretch out like a welcome season onto the meadows and shores and hills. Open up to the roof. Make a new watermark in your excitement and love. Like a blooming night flower, bestow your vital fragrance of happiness and giving upon our intimate assembly. I'll let you read the rest. So, eco-spiritualities. These are highly personal. So, for example, there's a spot on the planet that my family calls Grandma's Spot. When my mother died really young, my sister and I were driving the Pacific Coast looking for a spot to grieve and to recover. And we parked the car and walked down this tiny little one-lane road and found the spot that we brought 3 generations, 4 maybe now, back to over and over again. It's a spot where you lean back against that madrone tree, you can see a little bit of it, and look out over the Pacific Coast. You have over 360 degrees, no sign of a road, house, power line, no sounds or sights of human civilization. Below you, this is telephoto lens, is an old growth redwood forest. That's about a mile, almost a mile down the one-lane road. And the one-lane road weaves through it for about a mile down to Fort Ross, north of the Russian River. This is where my family's been for 5 generations. The rolling hills are the coastal ecosystems that some of you may know from trips to San Francisco and north. And again, not a sign of any touch by humanity. The forests are open. The grass this year is super tall because we have a lot of rain after January. And at one spot, again, telephoto, you can see down through the trees to the Pacific Coast. You can hear the waves crashing against the beach. And you can even smell a little of the salt mingling together with the smell of redwood forest, which is an incredible smell, and the grasses and flowers around this spot. I have told hundreds of audiences you can't get what environmentalism is unless you love a spot of earth so much. You do it for that spot. I did projects with Jane Goodall years ago, and we were walking in a jungle in India and came into a clearing, this old 1940s runway, concrete runway. We sat down, it was kind of crumbling. There's a little flower growing out between the bits of concrete. And she said, she does this Roots and Shoots program, 87 countries around the world, projects for kids to be involved in to transform their environment. And Jane looked at that and she said, there's no place on earth where a kid can't find a flower or some part of nature and learn to cultivate. It isn't just those who have a privilege to be able to go to Grandma's Spot, or live in Scotland, right? Every child, she said, has been able to find some spot and care for it. Do you see why that's eco-spirituality? Can you see the connection there? It leads to environmental ethics, environmental philosophy, and ultimately to this kind of worldview that motivates. And nobody has said it better, I think, than Aldo Leopold, one of the founding fathers of the field, This is almost a scriptural quote in my field. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the violent community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. As my teenagers say, boom. I mean, that just in a single sentence in the almanac, he captures this. Okay, I'm going to leave that there, but could spend hours talking about eco-spirituality because I want to move on to the hard part in the closing 10 minutes. Okay, we got it. By contrast, forming new beliefs or formulating old beliefs differently at the intersection of religion and ecology seems to be far more difficult. Perhaps religious leaders are telling people that it's heretical to update their religious beliefs in this way. Or perhaps people think that linking scientific results with religious beliefs, combining science and faith, is inherently anti-scientific. Of course, nobody attending a James Gregory lecture would ever have such a thought, because these lectures are dedicated to, quote, cutting-edge perspectives on the relationship of faith and science. But I'm guessing that most of you find the belief side of religion and ecology more difficult. So that's what I'd like to close with. And talk about the new eco-theologies. So what are the central belief commitments of an eco-theology? Or again, you can do this in more secular terms, eco-philosophy or eco-worldview. I'm going to use this one, but you can do the translation in your head if you want. I'd like to think them through with you under three headings: panentheism, emergence, and interdependence. My claim is that if we get these categories straight, it's not hard to get clear on what practices would follow. Panentheism is the view that the divine or the sacred permeates the world, and all things exist within this sacred presence. You can be a naturalist or a scientist and still be a panentheist. This worldview affirms the laws of nature and the integrity of the natural order, while also affirming at the same time that this same natural order exists within a sacred or a divine presence, is infused by that presence. Note that panentheists don't say that the world is God, that would be pantheism, but they also don't affirm a God who is utterly separate from the world, as in, say, classical theism. People who hold this view affirm that the patterns of the natural world can be studied in two ways and described with two different languages. That's important. Panentheists fully affirm each of the natural scientific accounts: physical cosmology, quantum physics, solid-state physics, chemistry, evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, biocultural studies, and so forth. At the same time, they look for analogs between the scientific results and the language of spirit or some kind of transcendence. They emphasize the sacred nature of the natural world. Some panentheists draw on traditional theological language in describing their beliefs, as I've done in my books. Others use the language of multiple religious traditions. Some speak of an ultimate unity of all reality, using more mystical terms. Others draw strongly on the language of nature, like Ursula Goodenough in the example. But when they do so, they recognize it in the famous words of Wordsworth as, where did we lose Wordsworth? Come on, buddy, don't go away. A sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns and the round ocean and the living air and the blue sky and in the mind of man. A motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. It's a nature poet. but a sense, I don't know any sentence in English language that says it more in a more pithy and powerful way. A sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused. Hey, I could do this, couldn't I? The second foundation of eco-theology is emergence, or emergent complexity. A world that reflects the divine in different ways at different levels of complexity. Life developed from simple prokaryotic cells to eukaryotic cells. It gradually became multicellular. Cells took on different functions. The complexity of life forms increased. Aquatic life moved onto land at multiple points, evolving new forms and structures, adapting to its environment in new and surprising ways. As the dinosaurs died down about 65 million years ago, mammals began to grow and to evolve into new mammalian species. Paleobiologists trace the lineage from those little mammals to the genus Homo, eventually to Homo sapiens. You know the rest of the story. The core premise of modern biology is that even though life developed different lineages, all these living beings have a common origin. Our bodies and behaviors may differ, but all species of the tree of life are connected. Bonobo brains and human brains differ in size and complexity, so number of layers, lobes, extent of cortical folding, gyrification, and behavioral differences are traced back to these differences. A religious tradition may affirm that humans have souls and bonobos don't, but this isn't a conclusion one can deduce from the science. Eco-theology celebrates this common lineage of emergence of all living things. We are part of the same story. We have a common origin and a common destiny. We are part, but only part, of the glorious emergence of life. I'll skip over some quotes in the longer version and move on to the final feature of eco-theology is interdependence. Here, ecology and religion come together, I think, most clearly. No life forms exist independently of their ecosystems. A functioning ecosystem is an emergent reality that is affected by all the species that inhabit it in their myriad interactions, and every individual is in turn affected by its ecosystem. Almost like a primary law of life. Biodiversity is as important as cultural diversity. Cultural diversity offers people a vast number of different ways to behave and to think about the world, providing us with more options for overcoming problems and challenges. Similarly, biodiversity, with its rich gene pool, gives all the life forms in an ecosystem the best chance of surviving external changes and threats. Interdependence. Okay, here's the thesis sentence. Eco-theology is the celebration of this interdependence of all life forms in the biosphere as a sacred reality. It resists efforts to abstract humans from their natural environment. Eco-theologians advocate for policies and lifestyles that preserve all living things, together with the ecosystems and biodiversity that we rely on. As a world and life view, eco-theology thinks in terms of the biosphere as a whole, not only through the sciences of ecosystem studies, but also through the theory and practice of creation care. So ecosystem studies, creation care, is two conceptual sides of a unified belief system of science and faith. In the biblical story, God placed humans on this garden planet with the charge to tend and cultivate it. Now that humanity has entered the Anthropocene and humans control the world's ecosystems, the urgency of creation care deepens. Rising temperatures threaten our beautiful green planet, its rich ecosystems, and all the interdependent species that inhabit them. But for eco-theologians, avoiding this outcome is not only a biological, political challenge, it's also a challenge for religious people to respond to as well, inherently and equally. And ecologically oriented spirituality plays its important role, and yet theological beliefs are important resources also. A religious worldview becomes a major motivation for environmental living and acting. I'm going to skip over a section on hope. Maybe we'll come back to that in the conclusion and simply conclude briefly. But it's only true if you put it on the screen. We have seen that eco-theology combines the study of ecology and religion. Both sides of this study call for humility. Humanity is tiny compared to the biosphere as a whole, or in religious terms, we are tiny in comparison to an infinite God. If we live within our planetary boundaries, or in religious language, if we live a life of humility before God, we and the planet will survive and thrive. But if we try to make of ourselves, biologically speaking, an exception to the ecological principles on which we depend, or in religious terms, if we seek to be God, we will not thrive. In short, this combination of ecology and theology that I have offered you this evening turns the affirmation of human dominance on its head. It is we who are dependent on the biosphere as a whole, on Gaia, as some people say. Without us, the biosphere self-regulates, balances reestablished, species thrive. It is not the world that depends on us, but we on it. Thank you very much.
Great, well thank you so much for a superb lecture, giving us so much to think about. Professor Clayton has kindly agreed to answer some questions now, but before we do so, can I just mention that afterwards there's some a drinks reception, so please stick around and have a drink and chat further about the lecture. And so, but now to questions. So you'll see that there are two roving mics, myself and Chris up for that. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the mic to be brought to you. And I would also ask that you could keep your questions short and to the point. So, do we have any questions?
Hi. Thank you for the inspiring lecture. And I really appreciate your optimism and the sense of hope and where theology can go in this important endeavor. I guess my question is about some of the, I guess going back to the beginning of the lecture and asking kind of why is it that there is that correlation between religious belief and the lack of well, I guess faith in scientific method.
Yeah.
And I wonder what beliefs will need to be lost or changed in order to fit into an eco-theology. And I'm thinking, like in my own tradition, we have a tradition of kashrut, of what we can and cannot eat, that allows for the possibility of eating meat, right? And yet I, seeing the danger of eating meat, think that is wrong. And it'll be sad to lose my grandmother's recipes, but that belief, I think, is actually going to hold us back. And similarly, beliefs in the afterlife. I'm tempted to care more about a future that I don't see reflected in the world here. And there, I think, are a number of very difficult, like deeply held beliefs that will, need updating. And so I wonder how those, fit into the trajectory of where theology can go, and how that, holds back that process.
It's a great question. I think a book wants to be written as I listen to your question. But let me choose 4, just to make it really sharp in response. A theory of religious, number 1, a theory of religious exclusivity for one's own religion. So our religion holds all truth, the other ones are false. That creates internecine warfare, so warfare between the traditions. It also dulls the message of commonality across the traditions, tends to make it invisible. That's problematic. Number 2, an otherworldly focus as compared to a religion that cares about how you live within this world. It's really interesting that before, say, Second Maccabees and late in the intertestamental period, Nefesh, so Judaism didn't have a strong, eternal soul. Nefesh was breath, and breath lasted as long as the body lasted. By the time of, say, Second Maccabees 7, then you had a much more developed notion of afterlife. But that's never been central to Jewish practice. Whereas in Christianity and Islam, it really is central. Buddhism has been interested because it kind of goes back and forth, interestingly, on that one. Confucianism never looked to an afterlife so strongly. So the different traditions took different answers on this, but it's the otherworldly religion versus the religion focusing on this world. I'm trying to move up, to number 1. The third, I would say, is an understanding of the ultimate as being separate from the world. Obviously linked to number 2, but not identical. When you understand, I was a little boy and taken to a Presbyterian church, and our pastor had us little 11-year-olds or whatever memorize what was God. God was, I can still remember, I got an A on the test. I got to wait for a little bit of grape juice out of it. God is a spirit, infinite and eternal in his being and perfections. God is spirit, infinite, eternal. And then all the perfections had nothing to do with the world. They were like omni things that are omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent. Pretty big words for an 11-year-old. Problematic! Right? It never said, God is the force that binds us all together. It was very otherworldly, so that would be the third one. And the last one, and the most damaging of religions of the world, is that humans are different from the rest of the world. When you put us on that pedestal, it gives us the right to rape and pillage ecosystems because they don't matter. It's just scientifically false. Religions don't have to have that view. It's not built into most of them, but it's become the dominant view. That's a great question. I will write the book. But those would be the 4 that I would prefer.
A brief comment on the 2 languages, which I feel is a major problem between science and religion. As a scientist who grew up in Scotland with all the beauty of the world, I have a lot of advantage and learning the language of religion too. But if you talk to particularly evangelicals in the US, the lack of scientific understanding is major. But I think it's more general. I think that there isn't enough science education, there isn't enough familiarity with the language of science anywhere, and the US suffers from that a lot.
Yeah.
I lived in the US when they were still trying to teach creation as science.
In schools.
In schools. And it's this lack of understanding of the language of science, I think, that puts a lot of blocks in the way. And how to overcome that, and overcome it in a world where the majority of people live in cities without, they may be able to grow up in, but they're not exposed to nature at all. So how do you do that?
I talked to Professor Torrance earlier, who was trying to get one of the greatest geniuses on that in the world, Catherine Hayhoe, into this series. I think it might happen someday, it might have happened with, in the past. But just to watch the way that she integrates two languages for somebody whose primary listeners are American, white evangelicals. And I think it's an art form. It's a form of poetry that scientists and theologians both need to learn. I tried to do it in the text and in the conclusion, going back and forth between the two languages to evoke for you the sense of how they flowed into one another, like without conflict. And brilliantly, Ursula Goodenough did it in her quote that we looked at, right? We can do that. It's given as scientists to be able to reach out to religious minds by describing their science in certain ways. It's given to religious leaders, scholars, theologians, and lay people to reach out to scientists with a language of integration. Just as being bilingual is a gift, or being multicultural is a gift, so this gift is important, maybe essential to this planet, at least of humans being alive on this planet, to be bilingual in that way. I just think of a dramatic moment at the World Parliament of Religions in Melbourne in 2008, I guess, and a Nobel Prize winning scientist was part of a panel that we'd set up on science and religion, basically. And all these people spoke about both, and at the end, it was his turn, he came forward on stage, like hundreds of religious leaders sitting in this auditorium, and he said, I have no religion to offer at all. I'm just not a touch religious. But I recognize that my lectures around the world since I got the Nobel, giving the data about climate crisis is not getting through. The numbers and the reasons and the theories aren't getting through. You guys are in the business of changing lives, motivating altruistic action. We have to work together. I will help you to make sure you understand the science, because you can't teach if you don't know it, and you can help find the language that causes people to be motivated, inspired, and ready to change their lifestyles. And that's what I heard in your question, is the crucial nature of that working together. I think there's nothing more. I mean, these are the two great forces, as C.P. Snow had said, right? Two great forces of, or what was it for Einstein, the two wings, right? Of the bird. And without the work together of these, that's why this lecture series is really important. Your being here tonight is of global significance, because it's dedicated to keeping those two wings in harmony and equal strength. So I love your question.
Can I thank you first of all for the clarity and rigour of your presentation, which was masterly. You mentioned the notion of planetary boundaries, and I'd like to explore that a bit further. Last week there was a remarkable lecture by Johann Rostrom from the Potsdam Institute, who has been working on this notion of planetary boundaries for about 20 years. Yeah. His most recent paper suggests that 6 out of the fundamental planetary boundaries have now been exceeded.
And the 7th is?
And tipping on the 7th. He also explored very interestingly how close we are to tipping points, which I'm sure we're very familiar with. But what was remarkable about his presentation at the end, and you echoed it this evening, I think, was that we are not so far down the path that we cannot turn this round. And you mentioned the word hope as something that you would come back to. So I wonder if, rather like him at the end of his lecture, you could just share with us the basis for a hopeful outcome of this phenomenon which we are currently.
It's a fantastic question. The fact that you put it in light of these new findings on planetary boundaries makes it all the more poignant. If I could ask Professor Torrance, when it gets time for the last question, which you will decide, I would love to answer his question.
Make that last question.
There we go.
Yes.
He's over there. But start. Yeah, 3 moments. In the 1990s, people were on the lecture circuit talking about climate change and the importance of environmentalism. I was teaching that in a state college. And you get up in front of an audience and you give these hopeful comments, we can do this, and then you get together for a beer afterwards and you talk about the most recent data. And it was a weird kind of bifurcation that in public, we wanted to really inspire people, and in private, we're really saying, well, this is not looking good. This number, this trend, right? I mentioned the Harvard scientists, that some of the top experts in the world struggling with hopelessness. In about 10 years ago, my co-author Steve Knapp and I published a book with Oxford called The Predicament of Belief, Science, Philosophy, Faith. And the idea was that it's like Matthew Arnold's sense that faith is declining, the belief is declining. We're worried that people who hold religious beliefs are in a kind of predicament, and we gave reasons to sort through that. 10 years later, we're about to publish a book, I hope with Oxford, as a second in the series, called Hope Beyond Belief. Not only has religious belief continued to decline, between 2021 and 2023 in the United States, the people who identify as religious dropped 8% in 2 years. And nobody indicated interest in religious identity of what we talked to 50, 60 high school students earlier today, right? Not only is religious belief declining, but we have the opposite problem. We have a kind of weed-like proliferation of belief in everything, right? Which means that the rigor of tested beliefs is lost. It's like no longer seems to be important to the vast number of people. And just holding whatever belief the others in your chat group hold seems to be sufficient. So we have a double problem, right? And then on top of that is, how do we regain hope, right? So when belief is either being lost or becoming valueless because of a kind of belief inflation, right? And when the data don't seem to suggest hope, what do we do? It makes me, I wasn't going to say this, but it makes me think of a brilliant Brecht play called Mutter Courage, Mother Courage. And she's trying to get her family through the battlefields into a safe place, and she's losing members of her family one by one who wander off or are killed or something. And there's this final scene where after the loss of, they've lost the ox by then, she takes up the two arms of the family wagon and walks off stage. We have no choice, right? As long as there's breath in our bodies, we are members of biological systems, of human communities, and of that human aspiration to find meaning in the things that we do. We need meaning the way we need water and air. That's what we are as animals. And we are strongest when we are in value-based communities of belief and practice. Maybe religious, maybe non-religious, or whatever kind. And I find there the groundwork of hope. So I guess I would urge, hope can be preserved if you make that commitment to find core community of value and the appropriate practices. You'll find that beliefs tend to rise along with the practices, that you foster those communities of whatever sort, that you not claim your community has priority over all others, but recognize that we are a species of communities, we're communities all the way down. As ecosystems, our communities all the way down. Lots of data on that. And hope comes when through those communities we do good things in the world. I think of Franz Rosenzweig, Stern der Erlösung, the Star of Redemption, who said, let's not look for Messiah as this individual, powerful person. It's when justice rolls down, Martin Luther King, if I can mingle Christian and Jewish, when Amos, yes, but quoted famously by Dr. Martin Luther King. Yeah, I do appreciate your interest. So I'm still within the Jewish text. If we can recognize that our efforts can cause the world to be a better place, we're not only on the right side with science, we're also on the right side with that religious hope and aspiration. And not only do I believe we have no choice but to try to do it as long as they're wrapped in our